I almost killed a man with a dinner plate and a 12-word note, and if I had just kept my head down like every other night, my life would have stayed small and quiet and safe. But it didn't, because the moment Adrian Russo walked into that restaurant, the air changed like a storm rolling in off the Hudson, and every instinct in my body told me to look away, except I didn't. I was 24, working a double shift in a Manhattan steakhouse where the cheapest entree cost more than my weekly groceries. Balancing a tray that felt heavier with every step, my feet aching inside worn black flats, the kind no one notices unless you trip and spill something expensive, which is exactly what I was trying not to do when the doors opened and silence followed him. Not loud, not obvious, just subtle, like conversations lowering half a notch, like glasses pausing midair, like the room itself was paying attention. And I didn't know his name yet, but I knew power. When I saw it, tailored suit, perfect, posturized, that didn't scan the room, they owned it. He sat without looking at the menu, like choices were a formality, like the world had already arranged itself in his favor. And I told myself he was just another rich customer until I walked past the private hallway and heard the words that didn't belong in a place like that, not shouted, not whispered, just said with certainty, the kind that doesn't need volume. Don't worry, he won't taste it. And something inside me went cold, because I knew exactly which table they meant. I knew exactly whose plate I was carrying back to the kitchen with hands that suddenly didn't feel like mine. The chef plated the dish perfectly, like always, steam rising clean and harmless. Nothing about it looked wrong, nothing about it should have made my pulse spike the way it did. But I couldn't unhear what I'd heard, and I couldn't pretend it didn't matter, because maybe he was dangerous, maybe he was everything people warned you about, but no one deserved to walk blindly into something like that, not without a choice, not without a warning. So I stood there for 1 second, maybe too long, enough for my heart to pound so loud I thought someone would notice. Then I grabbed the receipt slip, flipped it over, and wrote, "Don't eat it." My handwriting shaky, ink pressing too hard into the paper, like I could force the message to carry weight. And I slid it beneath the edge of the plate where only he would see it if he bothered to look. And when I stepped out onto the floor again, everything felt sharper, the lights too bright, the clink of silverware too loud, my breathing too uneven. I placed the plate in front of him without meeting his eyes, like I'd done 1,000 times before. Except this time wasn't the same. This time I stepped back and waited, and for a second nothing happened. He reached for the fork, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. And then his gaze dropped, not to the food, not to the table, but to the note. And everything stopped, not the room, not the people, just me, like I was frozen inside that moment, watching a stranger read the one decision that could ruin everything. His fingers paused just slightly, just enough that I knew he understood. And when he finally looked up, he didn't look angry, he didn't look confused, he looked directly at me, like he'd been expecting me all along. And that was the moment I realized I hadn't just interrupted his dinner, I had stepped into his world. And people like him didn't let things like that go unnoticed. He did not call the waiter, he did not raise his voice, he did not even touch the plate again. He just sat there with that same calm expression, like nothing had changed, except everything had, and I felt it. From 10 feet away, the shift, the attention, the quiet gravity pulling the room tighter around his table. I turned before he could say anything, because that is what you do when you realize you have crossed a line. You pretend it did not happen, you keep moving, you disappear into the rhythm of orders and refills and polite smiles. But my hands would not stop trembling, and every step back toward the kitchen felt heavier, like I was walking through something thick and unseen. I told myself he would ignore it, that men like him did not take warnings from girls like me seriously, that maybe he would laugh it off or assume it was a mistake or a prank, anything that would keep this night from unraveling further. But the moment I pushed through the kitchen doors, Marco was already looking at me too closely, like he sensed something was off. "Emily, table 12 asked for you specifically." My stomach dropped. Table 12 was his table. I forced a nod, wiped my hands on my apron, even though they were not wet, just cold, and stepped back out into the dining room, where everything looked exactly the same and yet completely different. He had not touched the food. The plate sat exactly where I left it, steam fading into nothing, his fork resting beside it, untouched, like a decision paused in time. And his eyes were on me again, not impatient, not annoyed, just focused, like he was waiting for something only I could give. I walked up slowly, each step measured, careful, like I could control the outcome if I controlled my breathing. "Can I get you anything else?" Or my voice sounded steadier than I felt. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached forward finally, but not for the fork. His fingers slid under the edge of the plate, lifting it just enough to reveal the note, completely exposed now between us. And then he did something I did not expect. He folded it once, clean, precise, and placed it on the table, like it mattered, like it was not just a scrap of paper with hurried ink. "You wrote this," he said, his voice low, even calm, but there was something underneath it, something that made my chest tighten. I hesitated just long enough to make it obvious that I was thinking about lying, and then I nodded yes, sir. His gaze did not break from mine. Why? I swallowed hard, searching for something safe, something small. "Because it looked wrong," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were not enough, because nothing about him suggested he accepted surface answers. And still he studied me for a moment longer, like he was measuring the space between what I said and what I meant, and then he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Tell your manager I will not be eating tonight." The words were simple, but the way he said them carried weight, like a decision that extended far beyond dinner. I blinked, surprised. "You are not." I stopped myself, correcting the sentence. "Yes, sir, I will let him know." And I turned to leave again, hoping that would be the end of it, hoping I could still step back into the version of this night where I was invisible. But before I could take more than 2 steps, he spoke again. "Emily." I froze. My name sounded different in his voice, not loud, not threatening, just certain, like it belonged there. I turned slowly. "How did you know my name?" I asked before I could stop myself, and for the first time something almost like amusement flickered in his eyes. "Because you decided to involve yourself in my life," he said quietly, "and people who do that do not stay strangers." And just like that, I understood that whatever I had tried to prevent with that note had already begun. The rest of my shift passed in a blur that felt too sharp to be real, like every sound was turned up too high, and every movement carried weight I could not explain. I told Marco exactly what he wanted to hear, that the customer at table 12 declined his meal and needed nothing else, and Marco only frowned for a second before shrugging, because wealthy men change their minds all the time, and it was not our job to question it. But I could feel it even from across the room that nothing about this was normal. Adrian Russo did not leave. He stayed seated long after his untouched plate had gone cold, his attention drifting, but never fully leaving me, like a shadow I could not step out of. And every time I passed near his table, my chest tightened, waiting for something to happen, for someone to confront him, or for him to stand and walk out and end whatever invisible thread had formed between us. But none of that happened. Instead, time stretched slow and deliberate until the dinner rush faded and the restaurant began to empty, chairs scraping softly against the floor, conversations dissolving into the quiet hum of late-night Manhattan. And that was when I realized he was still there, still watching, still waiting. Like he had nowhere else he needed to be except exactly where I was. At 10:47, my shift officially ended. I untied my apron with fingers that still would not steady, and told myself to leave quickly, to walk out the back door like I always did, and pretend this night never existed, because that was the safest choice, the only choice that made sense. Except the moment I stepped into the narrow hallway leading to the exit, I saw them, 2 men in dark suits, standing just far enough apart to look casual, but not enough to miss anything. And they were not blocking the door exactly, but they were not moving either, and I knew without asking who they belonged to. My pulse picked up, and I turned back, instinct taking over, searching for another way out, except there was not one that did not pass through the dining room and through him. So I did the only thing I could. I walked back out, trying to look like I had forgotten something, trying to keep my expression neutral. But the moment I stepped onto the floor, his eyes were already on me, like he had been expecting it, like he knew exactly what I would do. And that was when he finally stood, not abruptly, not with force, just a smooth, controlled movement that somehow drew more attention than anything loud ever could. The room felt smaller as he walked toward me, not fast, not slow, just certain, each step measured, until he stopped close enough that I could see the faint detail in his expression, the calm, the focus, the absence of hesitation. "You are leaving?" he said. It was not a question. I nodded. "Yes, my shift is over." He studied me for a second longer and then glanced briefly toward the hallway where his men stood before looking back at me, and in that small movement, I understood something that made my stomach drop. This was not coincidence, this was arrangement. "You should not walk home alone tonight," he said quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried something heavier than concern, something that made me hesitate. "I always do," I replied before I could stop myself, and for a brief moment something shifted in his gaze, not disagreement, not exactly, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he expected that answer. "Then tonight is different," he said, and I felt it again, that invisible line being drawn around me, not trapping, not yet, but marking something I could not see. "Why?" I asked, and my voice came out softer than I intended. "Because you heard something you were not meant to hear, and you chose to act on it," he said calmly, "and now someone else might wonder why." And the way he said it was not threatening, it was not even urgent, it was simply a fact placed between us like a truth. I could not ignore. My throat tightened. I did not want to be part of this. I did not want any of it. I just wrote a note, I said quietly, as if that could make it smaller, as if that could undo what had already been done. And for the first time his expression changed, just slightly, not softer, not warmer, but something closer to understanding. A note can change everything, Emily, he said. And then after a pause, just enough to make the words settle, so can the person who writes it. I should have said no. I should have walked past him and pushed through that back door like I always did and let the night swallow me whole, but my feet stayed where they were, like something inside me understood before my mind did that this was no longer about choice. The restaurant lights felt colder now, half of them already dimmed for closing. The staff moving quietly around us, pretending not to look, pretending not to notice the way the space between me and Adrian Russo had become something charged, something fragile and dangerous in a way I could not explain. I am fine, I said finally, because it was the only thing I knew how to say, the only defense I had ever used against things I did not understand. I walk home every night. It is 2 blocks. He tilted his head slightly, not dismissing, not agreeing, just observing. 2 blocks can be very far, depending on who is watching. The way he said it made my skin prickle, not from fear exactly, but from awareness. Like suddenly the city I had known my entire life had shifted into something unfamiliar. I crossed my arms without thinking, a small barrier that felt useless the moment I did it. You are assuming someone cares enough to follow me, I replied, trying to sound steadier. Then I felt his gaze held mine longer this time, not intense, not harsh, just steady, like he was giving me space to hear my own words and understand them. People do not act without reason. Emily, you did not write that note for no reason, and neither did the person who arranged what you overheard. The calm certainty in his voice made it harder to argue, because part of me knew he was right, even if I did not want him to be. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint clatter of dishes being cleared in the background and the distant hum of traffic outside. I do not belong in whatever this is, I said quietly, and for a moment that felt like the most honest thing I had said all night. Something shifted again in his expression. Not pity, not sympathy, something closer to recognition, like he had heard that sentence before from someone else, maybe even himself. Neither do most people who end up in it, he replied, and there was no judgment in his tone, just truth, simple and unpolished. I exhaled slowly, realizing I was more tired than I thought, more overwhelmed than I wanted to admit. What happens now? I asked, and I hated how small the question sounded because it felt like I had already given him more control than I intended. His answer came without hesitation. You leave with me. The words landed quietly, but firmly, like a decision already made. My heart skipped. I do not even know you, I said, and it came out sharper than I expected, a last attempt to push back, to reclaim something that felt like it was slipping. He did not react to the tone. He did not step closer. He did not step away. He simply watched me, like he was waiting for me to catch up to something he already understood. You know enough, he said. And then after a brief pause, his voice softer, not weaker, just more deliberate. You know that I did not eat that meal. You know that I listened to you. And you know that I am the only person in this room making sure you get home safely tonight. The logic in his words was unsettling because it made sense in a way I did not want it to, and I found myself glancing toward the entrance, toward the dark glass doors that led out into the city that suddenly felt less predictable than it had an hour ago. What if I say no? I asked quietly, and for the first time there was a flicker of something almost like restraint in his eyes, like he was choosing his next words carefully. Then I make sure you leave anyway, he said calmly, but I will not be there when you realize why. You should have listened. And something about that, not a threat, not a promise, just a possibility, hung in the air between us and made my decision for me before I even realized I was making it. I do not remember deciding to say yes. I only remember the moment my body stopped resisting, the moment something inside me shifted from pushing away to holding still, like I was standing on the edge of something I could not see, and stepping back was no longer an option. I nodded once, small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. His gaze softened, just slightly, not warmth, not kindness, just a quiet acknowledgement, like a contract had been sealed without words. This way, he said, and turned without waiting to see if I would follow, because he already knew I would, and that certainty unsettled me more than anything else. The restaurant felt different as I walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, just beside, like the space itself had rearranged to make room for his presence. The few remaining staff members avoided looking at us, their movements quicker, their voices lower, like they understood something I did not. As we passed the front entrance, the doors opened before we reached them. One of the men from earlier stepping aside smoothly, like this had all been planned long before I wrote that note. The night air hit me immediately, cool, sharp, carrying the distant sound of traffic, and something else, something quieter, that made me aware of every shadow, every passing car, every reflection in the glass windows across the street. New York had always felt alive to me, loud and constant and predictable in its chaos, but standing there now, it felt like something watching, something waiting. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself, more out of instinct than cold, and for a second I hesitated again. The sidewalk stretching out in both directions, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You can still walk away, a voice in my head whispered, just turn left, keep going, do not look back. But my feet did not move because Adrian had already stepped forward, already set the direction, and somehow I knew that if I turned away now, I would not just be leaving him, it would be stepping into something I was not prepared to face. The car was waiting at the curb, black, polished, quiet, in a way that felt intentional, the kind of car that did not need to draw attention to be noticed. One of the men opened the rear door without a word, and I paused just long enough to feel the weight of what I was about to do. I have never gotten into a stranger's car before, I said softly, more to myself than to him. He stopped beside me, and for a brief moment the city noise seemed to fade again, like it had inside the restaurant, like everything narrowed down to this one decision. You are not getting into a stranger's car, he said calmly. You are getting into mine, and the difference in the way he said it did not make it safer. It just made it clearer. I looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time since we stepped outside. Not just the suit, not just the presence, but the stillness underneath it, the control, the certainty, the absence of doubt, and something else, something I could not name, but could feel like a quiet gravity pulling everything toward him. Why are you helping me? I asked, because I needed to understand something, needed a reason that made sense in my world. His answer came without hesitation. Because you helped me first. The simplicity of it caught me off guard because it was not complicated, it was not hidden, it was just there, plain and direct, and for some reason that made it harder to argue. I took a breath, stepped forward, and slid into the car. The door closed behind me with a soft final sound that echoed louder than it should have, and as the car pulled away from the curb, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think about until that moment. I was no longer going home. The car moved smoothly through the city like it belonged to a different version of New York, one I had never seen before, quieter, more controlled. The noise of traffic softened behind the tinted glass, and for a few seconds I just sat there staring at my reflection in the window, like I was trying to recognize the girl who had just walked out of her life, without a plan, without even grabbing her bag. My hands rested in my lap, still slightly shaking, but slower now, like my body was catching up to what had already happened. Adrian sat across from me, not too close, not distant either, just present, his posture relaxed but precise, like even stillness was something he chose carefully. Neither of us spoke at first, and the silence was not awkward. It was heavy, filled with questions I did not know how to ask, and answers I was not sure I wanted to hear. I finally glanced up, meeting his eyes again. They looked different in this light, less shadowed, more defined, but no less intense. Where are we going? I asked quietly, because the question had been sitting in my chest since the moment the car started moving. Somewhere safe, he replied without hesitation, and I almost laughed at that, because safe meant something very different now than it had an hour ago. Safe from what? I asked, and this time there was a pause, not long, just enough to feel intentional from uncertainty. He said, and the way he said it made me frown, because it sounded less like an answer and more like a warning. I looked back toward the window, watching the city pass by, streetlights sliding across the glass like fleeting moments I could not hold on to. I live on 32nd and Lex, I said, after a moment, the words coming out automatically, like maybe if I reminded him of something normal, something simple, it would anchor this night back into something I understood. He nodded once. I know. That made my chest tighten again. How do you know that? I asked more sharply than before, because this time I needed clarity. I needed to understand how far this had already gone. He did not look away when he answered, because when something changes my world, I learn everything I need to know about it, and right now that includes you. The calm certainty in his voice should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it left me feeling strangely exposed, like pieces of my life had already been placed in front of him without my permission. I shifted slightly in my seat, crossing my arms again, a habit I could not seem to break. You make it sound like I am a problem, I said, trying to regain some control. He shook his head slowly. Not a problem, a variable. I blinked at that. A what, a variable? He repeated something that was not part of the original equation, but now affects the outcome. I let out a small breath, because somehow that felt worse than being called a problem. It felt like I had stepped into something already in motion, something that had rules I did not know and consequences I could not predict. The car slowed slightly, turning onto a quieter street. The buildings here, taller, more polished, the sidewalks cleaner, the kind of area I only passed through on my way to somewhere else. My pulse picked up again. Where are we? I asked, and this time there was a hint of something else in my voice, not fear exactly, but awareness. My place, he said simply, and before I could respond, the car came to a smooth stop in front of a building that did not need a name to be understood. Glass, steel, and security that blended into the background like it had always been there waiting for us. The door opened before I could reach for it, and cool air slipped inside, carrying the faint scent of rain. I hesitated just for a second longer, my mind racing through every version of what could happen next, every reason I should stay where I was, and every reason I could not go back. And then I stepped out, because somewhere between the note and this moment I had already crossed too many lines to pretend I was still on the same side of them. The building rose above me, like something untouched by the noise of the city, all glass and steel, reflecting a version of New York that felt distant from the one I knew. I followed Adrian inside, because stopping now felt more impossible than continuing. The lobby was quiet, not empty, just controlled. The kind of quiet that came from people knowing exactly where they belonged and what they were allowed to see. A man behind the front desk nodded once as we passed. Not surprised, not curious, just aware, and that alone told me more than anything else. This was not a place people wandered into by accident. The elevator doors opened before we reached them, and I stepped inside. Without thinking, the space enclosed us in polished metal and soft light, and I caught my reflection again, hair slightly out of place, uniform still on, like proof that I had come from somewhere completely different and maybe still belonged there. If I could just find a way back. The doors closed with a smooth sound, and for a second it felt like the world outside had been sealed away. The elevator moved upward fast enough to make my stomach shift slightly, the numbers climbing higher than any place I had ever lived or worked, and I realized I had no idea how high we were going or what waited when the doors opened. You can still tell me to take you home, Adrian said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence, not forcing, not expecting, just offering. And I turned to look at him, surprised, because the option felt out of place here, like it belonged to another version of this night. I studied his face for a moment, trying to understand what kind of man gives someone a choice after everything that has already been decided. Why would you offer that? I asked quietly, because I needed to know if this was real or just another layer of control. His expression did not change, but there was something steadier in his gaze, something that felt almost like respect. Because you made a choice when it mattered, he said, and I do not ignore that. The simplicity of it caught me off guard again, because there was no manipulation in the words, no pressure, just acknowledgement. And for the first time since I stepped into that restaurant, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not trust, something in between, something that made me realize I was not just being moved from one place to another, I was being seen in a way I had not expected. The elevator slowed, then stopped, and the doors opened onto a space that did not look like anything I had imagined, not extravagant, not overwhelming, just clean, open, deliberate, like everything in it had a purpose. Soft lighting stretched across wide windows overlooking the city. The skyline spread out below like something unreal, and for a moment I forgot to breathe, because I had never seen New York from this angle before, never seen it look this distant, this quiet, this controlled. It is not what I expected, I admitted without thinking, and he stepped out beside me, his presence steady. As always, expectations are usually based on incomplete information, he said calmly, and I almost smiled at that because it sounded exactly like something he would say. I stepped further inside, my shoes soft against the polished floor, and realized something else. There were no visible guards, no tension in the air, no immediate sense of danger, just space and silence, and the quiet awareness that I was somewhere I did not belong, and yet had been brought here anyway. What happens now? I asked again, because the question had followed me all the way from the restaurant and still had not been answered. Adrian turned toward me fully, this time his expression unreadable, but his focus entirely on me now. We find out who tried to change my fate, he said, and then after a brief pause, his voice lower, not darker, just more certain. And why you were the one who noticed. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, trying to process the way he said it, not dramatic, not threatening, just certain, like whatever had started tonight was already moving forward with Or without me, the city stretched out behind him through the glass, endless lights flickering like a thousand separate lives, none of them aware. That mind had just shifted completely. I do not know anything, I said finally, because that felt important to clarify, because I needed him to understand that I was not part of this world. I was not someone who uncovered secrets or solved problems. I was just a waitress who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place at the wrong time. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. You know more than you think, he replied calmly. And something about that made me uneasy, because it suggested that my role in this was not finished, that the note was not the end of my involvement. It was just the beginning. I looked away from him, toward the windows again, needing distance, needing space. To think, you said, someone might wonder why I wrote that note, I said slowly, repeating his words from earlier, because they had stayed with me, because they did not feel like speculation, they felt like a fact. He nodded once. Yes. And you think they are watching me now? I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended, because suddenly the idea did not feel abstract, it felt real, it felt close. His answer was immediate, not alarming, just direct. I think they will be soon. The calm way he said it made my chest tighten more than if he had raised his voice, because it left no room for doubt. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. This is not my life, I said again, softer this time, more to myself than to him, because I needed to hold on to something that felt normal, something that reminded me that this was temporary, that I could still step back at some point. Adrian moved slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to shift the space between us, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, not darker, just more deliberate. It was not my life either. Once that made me look at him, really look at him, not the power, not the control, but the person underneath it, the one who had not always been this, the one who understood exactly what it meant to be pulled into something you did not choose. What changed? I asked before I could stop myself, because the question felt natural, because for the first time I wanted to understand him, not just what he represented. He held my gaze for a moment longer than usual, like he was deciding how much to say, like he was measuring the weight of the truth before letting it out. A single decision, he said finally, and then after a pause, just enough to let the words settle. One moment where walking away was no longer possible. Something about that stayed with me, because it sounded too familiar, because it mirrored exactly what had happened to me tonight. I wrapped my arms around myself again, not out of fear, but out of awareness, like I was trying to hold on to the version of me that existed before all of this. And failing, what do you need from me? I asked, because the question felt inevitable, because I knew I would not be here if the answer was nothing. He did not hesitate when he responded, I need you to remember everything you heard and everything you saw tonight, every detail, no matter how small. The request sounded simple, but the way he said it made it clear that it was not just a request, it was a step, something that would lead to whatever came next. I nodded slowly, because I understood that much, because I knew that once I started looking closer, once I started thinking back, I would not be able to stop. And as I stood there in a place that did not belong to me, with a man I should not have trusted, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think about until now. This was no longer about what I had done, it was about what I was about to become. It started with something small that should have been forgettable, a fragment of sound, a detail that did not matter until it did. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to replay the moment in the hallway outside the kitchen, the voices, the tone, the way the words had been said, not rushed, not nervous, just certain, like a plan already in motion. Don't worry, he will not taste it, I repeated quietly. And when I opened my eyes again, Adrian was watching me closer, now not impatient, not pushing, just waiting, like he understood that whatever I remembered next would change something. The man speaking, I continued slowly, his voice was steady, not afraid, not uncertain, and he said it like he believed it would work, like it was guaranteed. Adrian nodded, once his expression tightening, just slightly at the edges. Continue, I exhaled, trying to focus on the pieces that felt out of place. There was another voice, I said, softer this time, lower, different. He did not respond much, just asked about timing, about delivery, like he needed confirmation, not control. Adrian's gaze sharpened at that detail, like it fit into something larger, something I could not see. Timing matters, he said quietly, more to himself than to me, and I realized then that this was not just about what almost happened, it was about how it had been planned, how close it had come to succeeding. I stepped closer to the window, without thinking, my reflection faint against the glass as the city lights blurred behind it. I did not see their faces, I added, because that part mattered, because I knew it would, but I remember something else, something small. Adrian did not interrupt, he did not move, he just waited, and that made it easier to think, easier to pull the memory forward, one of them said. Thursday, I said, and the word felt heavier now than it had before, like it carried meaning I had not understood at the time. Adrian's posture shifted slightly, not tense, just more focused. Thursday, he repeated quietly, like he was placing it somewhere in his mind, like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Yes, I nodded. And he mentioned the back entrance, not the main one, something about avoiding attention. The room fell silent again, but this time, it was different, not empty, not uncertain. It felt like something had been set into motion, like the air itself had shifted direction. Adrian walked past me toward the window, his reflection joining mine for a brief second before he stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the city below. Thursday changes things, he said finally, and there was something in his voice now, something deeper, not emotion, not exactly, but weight, like the future had just narrowed into something specific, something real. I turned toward him, my arms still wrapped around myself, not from fear but from the awareness that everything I had just said mattered more than I understood. What happens on Thursday? I asked quietly, and for the first time since I had met him, he did not answer immediately. He looked out over the city for a long moment, like he was measuring time itself, like he was calculating outcomes. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but certain. We find out who is willing to risk everything to reach me. And then he looked back at me, his gaze steady, unwavering, and I felt it again, that shift, that invisible line moving closer, drawing me further into something I had not chosen, but could no longer step away from. And in that moment, I understood something I should have realized sooner. This was never just about saving him. It was about what happens after you do, because once you change a man like that, you do not go back to who you were before, and neither does he.